Um, Thank you all for joining. We're very excited to welcome you to the Harvard International Law Journal's 2022 Symposium second panel on Black women in international law. This panel is organized in collaboration with Blacks of the American Society of International Law and the Women in International Law Interest Group. And the panel will be moderated by Dean Adrienne Wing. Dean Wing is the Bessie Dutton Murray Distinguished Professor at the University of Iowa College of Law, where she teaches critical race theory, sex discrimination law, and law in the Muslim world. She's also Associate Dean for International and Comparative Law Programs and the Director of University of Iowa Center for Human Rights. She is the author of over 150 publications, including contribution to the Cambridge University Press volume on Black women and international law. And she's the editor of Critical Race Feminism and Global Critical Race, Critical Race Feminism, Global Critical Race Feminism, and on the American Journal of International Law Board of Editors. Dean Wing is also former vice president of the American Society of International Law and a co-founder of the Blacks of the American Society of International Law. Thanks very much for joining us, Dean Wing. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tina, for that very kind introduction. On behalf of our entire panel, I would like to thank the Journal for hosting this symposium and for this historic panel on Black women in international law. As was stated, the panel is co-sponsored by BASIL, Blacks of the American Society of International Law, and WILIG, the Women's Interest Group of ASIL. We hope to make this program available through a link to our memberships in those two groups, as well as to broader viewership. It is my pleasure to be your moderator for the panel. I am going to pose questions to this distinguished group, which is comprised of the top Black women in the field of international law. I will first give them brief introductions. Their fuller bios are available from the journal bios affiliated with the symposium. I will first introduce Professor Gay McDougall. She is the senior eminence on this panel, and I have admired her since I was a law student and thought one day I want to be like her when I grow up. And I still feel like that, even though I'm a grandma myself. Anyway, Professor McDougall is the first American to serve on the UN Committee on the Elimination of Race Discrimination, and she was its chair in 2018 to 2019. President Biden nominated her to serve a third four-year term, and she's in that term. She was the first UN Special Rapporteur on minorities and was Special Rapporteur on the issue of systemic rape and sexual slavery practices in armed conflict. She was formerly the director of the Southern Africa Project of the Lawyers Committee for 15 years and was also executive director of Global Rights. Professor McDougall is currently an adjunct professor at Fordham Law School. She received her JD from Yale and her LLM from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and she has honorary degrees from 9 institutions. I will next introduce Ms. Patricia Sellers. She is Special Advisor for Slavery Crimes for the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. She is a visiting fellow at Kellogg College at Oxford. She's a practicing professor at the London School of Economics and senior research fellow at the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley. She served as the legal advisor for gender and a prosecutor at the Yugoslav Tribunal and legal advisor for gender at the Rwanda Tribunal. She holds an honorary doctorate in law from the City University of New York, as well as is an honorary fellow for lifetime achievement from the Law School of the University of Pennsylvania, which is her alma mater, and she holds her bachelor's degree from Rutgers. Next, I will introduce Professor Erica George. She is the Samuel D. Thurman Professor of Law in the S.J. Quinney College of Law and the director of the Tanner Humanities Center at the University of Utah. She teaches constitutional law, international human rights law, and seminar courses on equality, sustainability, and corporate responsibility. She earned her bachelor's from University of Chicago and her JD from Harvard. She also holds an MA in international relations from Chicago. Before entering the legal academy, she worked with Human Rights Watch and practiced corporate litigation in Chicago and New York City. Her new book is Incorporating Rights: Strategies for Advanced Corporate Accountability, which was published by Oxford Press last year. Professor Catherine Powell is a professor at Fordham Law School and visiting scholar at NYU School of Law's Center on Human Rights and Global Justice. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at NYU Law's Reese Center on Law and Security. Professor Powell's prior experience includes stints in the Obama administration. She was on the Columbia Law School faculty as founding director of the Human Rights Institute and Clinic. Earlier, she was a litigator at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. She currently serves as an adjunct senior fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations. She's a graduate of Yale College, Yale Law School, and the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, where she got a graduate degree. Our last and most junior person on this group, but certainly not least, is Professor Tendai Achiume, who is the inaugural Alicia Mignana Chair in Law at the University of California, Los Angeles. She's also a research associate of the African Center for Migration and Society at WITS, the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, and a research associate of the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford. She is also the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, the first woman to serve in this role since its inception in 1994. She's also a recipient of the UCLA Distinguished Teaching Award, which is the highest university-wide honor for excellence in teaching. She holds her bachelor's and JD from Yale. As distinguished as these bios are, these are just small portions of the accomplishments of each of these women. So I highly encourage you to look at the longer versions of their backgrounds. So now I'm going to begin my questioning. First, how did you each get involved in international law generally? And for those of you who are law professors in the teaching aspect, and what are your areas of specialization? There are not that many Black people who are in international law, much less Black women. So this is the first question. And if we were all live in a room, it would be easy to see who goes first, who goes second. So I will do the equivalent in my Zoom room. And the first person that I have to answer this question is Patricia Sellers.
Well, thank you very much, Adrienne. And this is a fabulous opportunity to meet some of my fellow sisters over Zoom and say hi again to those who we've been physically separated by COVID, but certainly not in soul and spirit. How did I get into international law? Well, I think that being an African-American who came up in the civil rights movement, who had heroes such as Paul Robeson, the national and the international in terms of human rights was always a blend. More specifically, when I worked in Philadelphia as a public defender, I simultaneously was always engaged in some type of civil society organization, such as the American Friends Committee, the Quakers, and would do human rights missions in Latin America for them. And I finally moved to Brazil to work with the Ford Foundation, and there specifically was looking at human rights as it applied to Afro-Brazilian women, as it applied to the communities that used to be called favelas. When I did move to Brussels, I felt so far from my previous practice of criminal law and human rights law, but lo and behold, an international criminal court was set up for the first time in Yugoslavia. And my mentor, Gabrielle Kirk McDonald, was appointed as a judge. I didn't know her then. I called her up to ask her, could I please just carry your books in and out of the courtroom? And the prosecutor understood that I was trying to get into the judiciary as a legal clerk. And he asked me, due to my human rights experience in Brazil and to the public defender's office in Philadelphia, where the overwhelming 99.9% of my clients were Afro-Brazilian and Latinas that were all economically deprived. And those crossroads of preparation, a little bit of aché came together for me. And so that's when I started what has been almost a quarter of a century in international criminal law. My specialties are sexual and gender-based violence as it relates to genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, and then human rights and humanitarian law.
Thank you very much. Next will be Gay McDougall.
Well, I think that like Patty, I grew up in the Jim Crow South, and we were always looking to the international, outside the country. We were thinking that, there was a different system that applied outside the country. There were people out there that were different, blah, blah. And then there was always a sort of internationalism in the community of Black people in the Jim Crow South. Not always talked or written about, but absolutely definitely there, and that touched me a lot. But I was very much involved in the support groups for the African liberation struggles in Southern Africa. I mean, before that, decolonization generally. And after law school, I, after some missteps, career missteps, I wound up at the National Conference of Black Lawyers. And one of the things I did there was I represented them in their NGO capacity at the UN. And, our thing was we're going to relate, political prisoners in the US with political prisoners in Southern Africa. So that was my beat. And through that, I got to not only see, the institutions of the UN and of international law functioning, but to see it functioning with respect to issues of self-determination, decolonization, things, notions that always thrilled me and people in my community when I was growing up. It meant something different to them, but it was there. So I packed up my stuff. I went to London, got an LLM at the London School of Economics, and I worked for the research division of the African National Congress of South Africa, which was headquartered in London at that time, along with all of the other, liberation movements from Southern Africa. So I got deep, deep, deep into that. And what I was doing was helping them frame their arguments and justify their activities in the norms of international law, and thereby also stretching the envelopes, the edges of the envelopes of international law to fit the liberation struggle. And so I was advised them to become, in short order, the first liberation movement to become a party to an international treaty, the protocol of the Geneva Conventions that had just been concluded at that time. from there just took off. I was actually deep into South Africa and the liberation movements until the end of apartheid. And I was on the Electoral Commission and all of that. So my specialties have always been issues of decolonization, self-determination, focusing on people of African descent and the issues that we have all over the globe. And of course, in that, the question of Black women.
Thank you very much. Next will be Catherine Powell.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Wing and the Journal and Tina and all the organizers. I'm a current co-chair of BASIL, following the footsteps of Adrian and the other founders of BASIL that's co-sponsoring this. And I have to say, it's such an honor to be, sort of bookended by my sheroes who I always looked up to, like Gay and Patricia on the one hand, and then my sheroes like Erica and Tendai, who are a little more junior than me. I love the intergenerational nature of this panel. So I have to say, I think like Gay and Patricia, and I think like many of us, my journey to international law was maybe typical of those in this Zoom room, but atypical of a lot of international lawyers. And so in a way, I think my experience is a lot like human rights lawyers in other countries who grow up in their domestic struggle for human rights, like our colleagues in South Africa, Latin America, et cetera. So I came to international law really from growing up in a family that was very committed to social justice. My father, who was a Harvard Law grad from 1956, was the first to go to college in his family. His parents were a domestic worker, taxi cab driver. And so, in the late 1940s, Blacks couldn't go to, white institutions. He went to Howard undergrad with Andrew Young, David Dinkins, and Toni Morrison were his classmates. And then, after being Phi Beta Kappa, got a full scholarship to Harvard Law School. And so he graduated just after Brown v. Board of Ed and got involved in, the civil rights movement. We moved to DC when I was 5. He chaired he was the general counsel of the Civil Rights Commission, which, was really set up as our domestic human rights institution, and then became chair of the Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. And so I grew up around sort of the dinner table talking about the civil rights issues of the day. But at the same time, our neighbors were diplomats, right? They were from India and Pakistan and Haiti, and worked at the World Bank. And so it was really at the moment when my dad went to London to meet with civil rights lawyers there that I began to understand that our struggle at home was part of this global struggle for human rights. And so in law school, basically, I didn't have the language for understanding how to put those two concepts together. And it wasn't until Harold Koh created a human rights clinic in my 3rd year of law school that I began to see that our domestic civil rights movement was part of this global human rights movement. And so after graduating, went to Harvard for a year to do a postgraduate fellowship in teaching international law, where I work with, had the great privilege of working with Abe Shays and Randall Kennedy, who funded me to go to Guantanamo to visit Haitians detained there, and met Amory Slaughter, who was visiting that year. So, and then actually just, meeting like Spencer Overton, who was a student who's now the head of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, with whom I'm consulting on a project on race and technology, and Samantha Power, who was another student who then hired me to work in the White House, the Obama White House years later. So that was a pivot point, and then clerking and working at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. But it was really seeing a job listing to teach at Columbia to create their Human Rights Clinic and Human Rights Institute, and joined the faculty as a clinical professor. That was, for me, moving from the Legal Defense Fund to Columbia, really making that link between civil rights and human rights, and then having the good fortune to be hired on a tenure track line at Fordham. Dipping into the Obama administration, I might be, I'm not sure, the only person in the Zoom room who has worked for the man. The man was Black, but nonetheless, Obama was, working in government is very different than agitating from the outside. And at a certain point, I just decided I want that experience to see the resources of the US government, how that could be deployed to address some of these social justice and human rights issues. So as director for human rights and the National Security Council, was able to work on a whole range of issues, and really bridging domestic civil rights and human rights was part of the goal. So that's really what brings me to the table and how I got involved in this field.
Thank you. I'm learning so much about each one of you, even though I've known you all for, many years in some cases. So this is just fascinating. Next will be Erica George.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Wing. Thank you to the students of the Harvard International Law Journal. It's good to be back. I actually had a short stint on your journal when I was in law school. And Catherine, we have to talk race and technology policy at some point. So I'm really struck by this room, and I think Catherine's right. I came to this from a domestic interest in civil rights. My parents are from Louisiana. They went to segregated schools their entire lives. My mother, I actually was born in Chicago because they had to flee the South because of my mother's political activities. And that was constant in my home as well. And I was also coming along at the time that the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa was burgeoning in the 80s and early 90s. So I think the connection hit as I started to learn more about the South African struggle, hear my parents' stories, returning to parts of rural Louisiana to see grandparents and seeing the disparity between different types of life in our country, and just was deeply bothered by inequality and racial injustice. And when I got to actually undergrad, I'd always been curious. I'd always loved to travel. I'd always had wanderlust. And I thought, oh, human rights, civil rights with international scope. This is what I want to do with my life. And so my graduate degree at Chicago was actually looking at anti-imperialism and post-colonial struggles on the continent, African continent, comparing different social movements in Francophone Africa and Anglophone Africa. With the Louisiana family heritage, there was a French Creole interest and element as well. So kind of my personal circumstance got me interested in connecting these concepts. And once I got to law school, Harvard Law School, there was a wonderful human rights faculty member there at the time. We all know Mikal Matua, who was very supportive in encouraging me to get to South Africa in 1994, right after the elections, 1995. So I took my January term and spent that working at the Center for Applied Legal Studies and with the Black Lawyers Bar at the time. They were doing research around restitution of land to Black South Africans, and coming from Louisiana Black farmers, this was important to me. And to see the way that law was being used as an instrument for people to get redress and get justice. Not the full picture, it's not uncomplicated, but it really reinforced for me the potential of the power of law to work towards justice if we eradicate unjust laws. So that's how I came to it, really just being curious, being in the right place at the right time, and being around people who were able to connect me so that I could pursue the interests and curiosities. After law school, I went to Human Rights Watch. Again, that was a cold call. I just happened to pick up the phone, and their general counsel used to answer back in those days and told me to come by. And I just started working. And then after law school, applied for a formal fellowship, spent a couple of years there, again, agitating from the outside, but in a professionalized way. I mean, they were very disciplined about documentation, monitoring, reporting, advocacy strategies and avenues, and that enabled me to make contacts in Geneva and learn more about the UN human rights mechanisms and systems. And I know the speaker after me is very familiar with those. So I just evolved into it over time and continue to teach and do advocacy work.
Thank you. And Tendai Achumi.
Thanks so much, Dean Wing, and thank you to the organizers. Though I have to say that my biggest thanks is actually to my co-panelists, and not for being in this panel, but just for the phenomenal careers and lives that you have had. As the most junior on it, I really feel as though even my presence in the Zoom room is very much a product of the battles that you have fought and the work that you have done. So thank you for that. And I don't say this, and probably haven't said it to many of you, but I often draw such great comfort from just knowing that you are also doing the work that you're doing, and that you have been able to remain whole in the process. So thank you for that. And to say a little bit about the questions that you put to us, I got into international law from actually, I'm realizing a different motivations from the other speakers. So I'm from Southern Africa. I was born in Zambia and actually grew up in Southern Africa. And I was born after the independence of both Zambia and Zimbabwe. And so in a period actually of, I think, a fair amount of optimism about what decolonization might have meant. So I never really thought that I would go into even human rights. I thought I wanted to be an engineer. I was really into physics and had this whole other life plan, and things changed in the region. I ended up in college here in the US and in a classroom that was taught by a Black woman. And actually I've been thinking about the role of Black women in shaping my career trajectories. And I had already started thinking about law because my dad is a lawyer. I've been thinking about what I might want to do with that. And then I took a seminar with Bernadette Atweheni, who is also a professor and who many of you likely know, called Law and International Development Policies. And for those of you who know Bernadette, she is electric in the classroom. And her classroom was on international development institutions and the roles that they have played in different parts of the world, including the African continent, not always for good, but often kind of being instrumental to subordinating communities there in ways that help explain dynamics that are taking place. And it was in her seminar that I started thinking about international law as the field where I might go to make sense of all the external factors that were shaping the part of the world that I was in, but had never really been able to name and address. That was kind of my initial an entry point into international law. But then where I am now, which is focusing more on international human rights law, international refugee law, and then also public international law as it relates both to racism, xenophobia, and migration, that journey was a kind of longer, more complicated one that I won't necessarily get into, except to highlight again the intervention of another Black woman who kind of set me on the course that I'm on, and who I often think without her, I wouldn't be doing the UN work that I'm doing. She's in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And when I started my academic career very early on, I was writing about xenophobic discrimination and trying to make sense of the ways in which international human rights law might be used to apply to xenophobic discrimination. And coming from practice, I had been practicing in South Africa, representing refugees and asylum seekers, and really starting to think about how xenophobic discrimination, racial discrimination against refugees and migrants wasn't making it into the human rights discourse of how we think about the challenges confronting migrants and refugees and how they might be addressed. Anyway, so I'd started writing about xenophobic discrimination in my scholarship, and I think I was in my second year or third year of being an academic. I got an email from the UN, which at first I thought was, it must be spam. Somebody's impersonating a UN office, but it was actually a woman there who was working within Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights and had done research online because they were having a convening focusing on a potentially new treaty on xenophobia. And she had seen my work and said, she emailed me and was like, I'd love for you to come and present. And I don't know if she would agree with this, but honestly, she was taking a chance on somebody who was very junior. And I have to think that somebody else in that role might not have done that necessarily. In any case, I traveled to Geneva and did a presentation to a committee of the Human Rights Council. And while I was there, she and a few other people mentioned that the rapporteurship that I'm in now was going to be opening up, and would I consider applying? And again, it seemed just entirely unlikely that I would end up in the role for many, many reasons. Some of them having to do with my age, my gender, all of these sorts of things. And also just a lot of my scholarship has been deeply critical of the UN system. Long story short, I did end up applying. I did end up in the position, but to my mind, when I think about this question, I can't separate it from the Black women who have been instrumental in different ways to making it so that I can be in the place that I am today. So I'll stop there and look forward to other questions.
Thank you. I'm going to interject a little about myself too, even though I'm also wearing the moderator hat. Like many of you, I was from a family of civil rights activists, my grandparents and my parents. My father was a life member of the NAACP in 1963, when that was considered an unbelievably radical thing to do. When I started college at Princeton in '74, I was active with the anti-apartheid movement. I went to Africa my senior summer to Kenya, and that made me think I want Africa as my career and not like a side issue. So I then did a master's in African studies at UCLA. And then I knew when I was going to Stanford Law School that I wanted to be an international lawyer. So I was fortunate enough to do a semester internship at the UN Council for Namibia, which was very transformative. And then when I became a lawyer, my day job was with a big international law firm in New York called Curtis Millay, Prevost, Colton Mosley. And then my pro bono work was with the group that Gay mentioned, National Conference of Black Lawyers. I became their UN rep, as well as I started the Middle East Committee for NCBL. And so I was in that role. And so I was wearing multiple hats at the UN. And once I became a professor, that's when I got into gender. And I also became part of critical race theory from the beginning. And so all of that intersected where I've ended up specializing in race and gender issues, both in the US and abroad. And the two regions that I specialize in are Africa and the Middle East. Okay, so that was great. And we'll now go to the second question. And this question is, what do you all think are key questions affecting Black women? And in answering this, do we need to define who is Black? Do we even need to deal with the fact whether the term Black women should be an organizing principle at all? Okay, so let me start again with Ms. Sellers.
Well, I really think that Gay and Tanda, our mandate holders, probably can speak to the framing. And I guess I would say just persons who are African or of African descent, and that might not be exactly a theoretical correct analysis. But when I refer to Black women, that's basically my framework. Issues within international law that relate to Black women are ones that incorporate everything, because the Black woman is a human being. So we're talking about issues in international law that relate to our humanity. And so I see that as a wide berth of different rights for persons who are differently situated. But in addition to that, that Black women, from my impression, worldwide face discrimination, particularly when they are located in certain geographies, and certainly in the Americas, from my experience, North and South America. And I've lived in Europe for over 30 years, certainly in Europe. And certainly when their geographies of Africa change and they are outside of Africa, I've met so many African women in different geographies who are astounded at the depth of discrimination that they confront and face, even within the legal profession. Everything from skin tone, skin color, background, and questioning per se their intellectual ability to contribute, not even dealing with the idea they might have contributed, but their intellectual ability to contribute, because international law is such a complicated, masculine,
Pompous.
I don't know, thing that only the reasonable person, i.e. not the human Black woman, can grasp.
Thank you. Next, Professor McDougall.
Well, I ditto to everything that Patty has said. I started a slightly different place that, I mean, it's just how I think about things is that, first thing that I see is that international law itself is built on doctrines of exclusion and racial hierarchies. Its origins are in a worldview that rejected the humanity of the vast majority of people on the planet. Certainly those who were outside the global north, those who were not white. In fact, international law started before they thought there were people outside the global north. So, and it gave, no agency to women at all, even white women. We got to recognize, or I do, that structural racism is systemic in all of today's multilateral institutions and policymaking forums. And so when I think about what we have to do for Black women in that context, is that first of all, we have to disrupt all of those doctrines and systems. And that has been a monumental task because, those doctrines and systems are like a vortex, it sucks you down into them unless you have yourself really clear about the worth and in many cases, the lack of worth of those doctrines. The human rights of people of African descent and women of African descent are both universal and particular. They're universal rights and particular locales and problems. But Black women in most of the many countries that I have visited around the world are still struggling with issues of liberation, decolonization, and self-determination. If not for their polity, meaning their country or their community, then certainly still for or with respect to their personal choices, their relationships, and their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those issues have national and international context and framings. They're all issues that I think intersect with each other and are relevant to the lives of Black women all over the world. The question of, the question of what do we use the word Black? I forget what the question was, something about, we speak now about people of African descent, which is to me a very unifying term, at least for those of us in the diaspora. We certainly need unity, and we need to avoid any spurious divisions. Although some have arisen, of course, certainly in the reparations debate, as I think all of my co-panelists well know, the whole question of, who gives the money and who pays the reparations, seems to be a set of issues that are thrown in our face with every time we try to make, pierce through the arguments for, against reparations. Now I see that the diaspora has had a massive spread throughout the globe. Of course, we all know that, Black people in Ukraine now. I first had a mandate to look at Ukraine 10 years ago, at which time I didn't know that there were Black people in Ukraine. So I was blown off my feet at how many are there. And now everywhere. there are at least 10 million people of African descent in the EU, not counting the UK, Brexit, or other places, Scandinavia, et cetera. Just 10 million in the European Union alone. And the flip side of that is that at least 10% of all people of African descent in the United States are first generation migrants. So they don't have the experience, they don't, the heritage of the transatlantic slave trade as part of their own personal, genealogy. So we are many, we are varied, but we all have to be one. And I hope that that will be the that will be the mission of this new institution that's been formed at the UN, that I'm so glad it's finally gotten off the ground. And it's another thing that we have to thank, George Floyd for. The new Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, which is not yet fully formed, but it will be a platform that, if done well, as it develops, will be a way for people of African descent across all the divides to talk to each other, not to others, about our issues, to form ways of working collaboratively within the multilateral space, and to reinforce each other in our national spaces. So maybe I've wandered beyond the question, but anyway,
That's okay. I actually have quite a few questions, so I'm going to switch up to not ask all of you all the same question. We did that in the first round, but if it's okay, so we can get to a few other issues. I want to move, because the first two of you really covered that second question very, very well, even though I'm sure the rest of you would have had things to add. So I'd like to move to our third question, which is, have US conversations on critical race theory impacted international law and Black women at all? And if so, how? Everyone in the audience, whether they'd ever heard of critical race theory before, certainly has heard of it in the recent year or more. So how about Professor Powell? Do you have any thoughts on this question?
Sure, yeah. I think just really building off of what Patty and Gay just said, oftentimes I find I'm the only Black woman in the room, right? And especially in terms of validating scholarship like critical race theory, critical feminist theory, it can be challenging, right? When you're the only one in the room. And so, I was the first Black woman scholar on the AJIL, on the American Journal of International Law Board of Editors. There had Natalie Reid was the first Black woman Jamaican American corporate partner, and has always been a very important ally. And having Adrian and Tendai in that room really helps a lot too. But, AJIL is, it's an elite journal. It's a journal that basically sort of helps canonize what international law is, what counts as international law. And so being able to talk about third world approaches to international law, critical race theory, critical feminist theory, critical theory, period, in rooms like that, it helps to have allies. So, I think part of what I feel like critical race theory has been so essential for my thinking about human rights. And so especially in this moment, I've been writing about color of COVID, the gender of COVID, looking at structural inequalities that we have to unmask, the way COVID has unmasked what had previously been invisible the structural inequality women face with COVID and remote learning and needing to be, primary caretakers to take time off from work, to be less productive in our scholarship, and the ways in which COVID has also unmasked, these racial justice paradoxes around people of color being frontline workers on the one hand, but also being underemployed, disproportionately unemployed, losing jobs during COVID. I think critical theory can help us document those kinds of phenomenon, make visible. I think this period, it's been so important to document what's going on with COVID and the impacts on communities of color and women. There's been a lot of coverage in the media, but being able to do that in a scholarly way, critical theory has been really essential to that. And as we come out of this pandemic or move into another phase, to think about how we can not just build back better, to use Biden's term, not to use this sort of like war framework of, the war against COVID of like a kind of Marshall Plan, right? But rather how we can use an ethics of care to build back in a more inclusive way, in a way that recognizes that we can't treat certain people as disposable, whether that's care workers or other people who haven't counted as full-fledged workers, who don't have the same benefits and labor law protections. We can't do what we did from the New Deal, coming out of other crisis moments like the Great Depression, of excluding domestic workers and agricultural workers from labor protections. I think we have to be very mindful in this period of how we can use critical theory to document what's going on and then push for more transformative solutions, to use the pandemic as a portal, to quote Arundhati Roy. So I think critical theory is really essential part of that.
Thank you. Professor George?
Oh, I'd agree with that. I have not seen, though I'm trying to introduce critical race theory or consciousness of racial disparity and discrimination in the fields in which I write, the corporate social responsibility field. There's lots of language around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and less real critical self-contemplation on what needs to change structurally, procedurally, in terms of policy. So I think that critical scholarship approaches can and should be part of that discussion. I also came along as TWAIL scholars, Third World Approaches to International Law. Writings were really taking off, and to see the reconstitution of the composition of editorial boards, the understanding that we need to look more broadly and look critically at doctrines that simply did not serve the ends of justice, and to have multiple perspectives, particularly when we've got 193 UN member states currently. I frankly think that it's a critical way forward, critical studies, whether it's TWAIL or critical race theory. Though academically they've grown up apart. I see a lot of critical race scholars that don't necessarily engage international literature. Some of that's changing, and international literature simply did not. And we are better for broadening what it is we know. So, yeah.
Thank you. And Professor Achiume.
Yeah, so I agree with the comments that others have made, and I would say a few things about CRT and Black women in international law. I think the first thing is to just name CRT as already being transnational in terms of the critical race theory framework being applied in different parts of the world, whether you're talking about Brazil, South Africa, France. There's been scholars who've been working within the field of CRT, and not necessarily in the mainstream in any of those countries, but definitely doing the work. And I'm highlighting the issue of the mainstream because it relates to something that I want to say later. And then within the UN system as well, I know I often am encountering innovations, developments that I can trace back to CRT. And here, one powerful example is the work of Kimberly Crenshaw on intersectionality, and her own advocacy, even at the Global Forum, I think has shaped and impacted ways of understanding intersectionality. And even though the intersectionality conversation now in the UN would not necessarily affiliate itself with CRT, and I don't want to say that the two are necessarily, it is because of CRT in the US that we have intersectionality at the UN. That's not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is that there have been critical race theorists who have been instrumental to shaping how concepts at the international level are deployed, even if they have been erased from the kind of genealogy of how we get there. I also want to mark the backlash against CRT, which is also
Yes, good.
transnational. And the backlash against CRT, I think, has been what has brought CRT into the mainstream consciousness transnationally as well, which has created really big problems again, where transnationally you will see CRT being associated with a racist endeavor, which is of course the opposite of what CRT is about. But whether you're talking about UK, France, they have been government-led mobilizations, which quite frankly demonize CRT as part of this kind of transnational backlash in ways that mirror some of the dynamics that we're seeing in the US as well. So I think it's very important to understand how political dynamics in the US can go transnational, both for good and for bad. And you see that with CRT. The one thing I'll say about CRT and Black women in particular, and this I also wanted to say in connection with your first question, Adrian, which is thinking about Black women and the issues that they face. In my own work as special rapporteur, I have been stunned, but also not stunned to find that in many of the countries that I visit, where there's racial justice advocacy, Black women are playing leadership roles. They are just doing so much. And it's striking because another thing that I experience side by side is that even though we can talk about how race is different according to local context and all of these sorts of things, one thing that I could say universally is that in every of the contexts that I'm operating, the combination of Blackness and womanhood is subordinating. You're not going to be at the top of any kind of power hierarchy, right? So seeing that Black women are in such powerful leadership advocacy positions and pushing for racial justice side by side with, you know, the extreme subordination is, I think, really remarkable. But the backlash against CRT, I think, has made many, and not just the backlash against CRT, other things as well, mean that Black women who are doing kind of racial justice advocacy, who are fighting for human rights, are among the most vulnerable, right? So thinking about safety here and just thinking about life and death, right? Whether we're thinking about human rights defenders who are on the front lines of pushing back against developments in, you know, parts of Latin America or wherever it is, deaths of Black women are something that we have to mark as a really serious issue that comes along with the work that we're doing. And I don't know if my co-panelists can speak to this, but I've been experiencing, as part of the anti-CRT backlash, personal targeting. And it's been one of the things in my mandate that has been the most striking, is realizing that the work isn't difficult just because the subject matter is difficult, but it's because my identity, who I am, how I am perceived, is part of the battleground. So that, you know, there's oftentimes I'll be in conversations, including with UN officials, thinking about security briefings. And if you're going to a country in the global south, they're like, oh, you're going, we really need to. But when you're going to countries in the global north, there's this presumption that it's safe. When you are a Black woman doing racial justice advocacy, it's many of those spaces that are the most dangerous, right? The ones where my first country visit was to the UK, and I will speak frankly, I was afraid sometimes for what might happen to me because of the vitriol towards people who are doing anti-racism work and towards women specifically who are doing anti-racism work. So this is all to say that when we think about the backlash against CRT, we can think that this is just about kind of ideologies being hashed out in different ways, but they are very real material consequences for the individuals who are in these systems, including at levels that you would think, oh, you must have the security, that means you don't have to worry about that. That is also kind of part of the picture that I think requires naming.
Thank you. I have always received threats as someone, you know, who's been involved with CRT and other things to do with race. And I live in a red state, Iowa. It went from voting twice for Obama to becoming this red state, except for the cities like what I live in, where it's a college town. And so there's a physical safety aspect of this. And I'm inspired by our sheroes and heroes around the world who have faced these things. Actually, in the Zoom world and in the COVID world, I've been asked to do more Zoom talks involving global critical race theory, global critical race feminism, and intersections with COVID, et cetera. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I was flying around. So there is this positive aspect. Now I'd like to move to the next question, which is, have you noticed a difference in how you're treated as a Black woman in international law based on what country or region you are living in or visiting? And I'll start with myself. Because I'm a light-skinned Black person, African-American person, when I first went to Africa, and even sometimes now, people will look at me and say, but you're not Black. And so when I have to explain, no, African-Americans range from very pale to very dark, but that really shook me that I wasn't being seen as Black by African people. On the other hand, being an international lawyer, I was like an honorary white man in many contexts where, you know, you're the only woman or the only Black person or the only Black woman in all of these very prestigious places. And so I knew I was getting more respect than I would if they just looked at me as a Black woman who was coming in to clean the room or do the meal or be in some kind of assistant role. So let's have Ms. Sellers. You are the only one of us living, I believe, now in Europe, and you've been living there a long time. And so this is a great question for you.
Adrian, I can understand what you're saying. And particularly, you know, I live very close to The Hague. I mean, a quick train ride. And The Hague is almost the center of international law between the different theoreticians who have lived there, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's stereotypes of what an international lawyer looks like or should look like. And some of those stereotypes really hold true because the majority of international lawyers do look like that kind of lanky Dutch stereotype in this part of the world, right? But I think what one has to state also is that I could say, oh, an intersectional vulnerability because I'm a woman, I'm a Black woman, but at the same time, I speak with an American accent. And so that will make them step back just a little bit. And then you know the type of union cards they like. You throw out that you've got an Ivy Law degree. I speak 4 languages. And so when they turn somewhere else, I can speak the fluent French. And you just keep throwing out your union cards and letting them understand that they really don't understand who they are dealing with. So now can we get to the ideals for the reason that we're speaking here? But that's a lot of energy and a lot of navigating that the other international lawyer who fits the stereotype doesn't have to do. They can act conspicuous or inconspicuous. I know from the moment I walk in that I'm on in many different ways. And some ways you're on because you have to respond to some of the inhumanity of American politics, and that you have to be on for that while living in your contradiction of being a descendant of American slaves. So there is a lot of complexity toward living in this body in these different spaces.
Thank you, Professor McDougall.
Yeah, when I saw your question, my mind went to actually where Patty ended, because for a long time, well, I established my focus has always been who I want to accept me, not as much the vitriol, et cetera, around. I mean, I've gotten that all my life, even in Georgia. But there was a period where you wanted to be considered not identified with the imperialism of the U.S. government, and that was my initial issue as I first started moving around the world. And I established my reputation as independent from government very long ago, so I didn't have as much problems starting in the 60s. And that sort of carried over through my work and my deeds, et cetera. But there was a long period of time, when because of the fact that the US was sort of opaque, from the outside, you step into the international space and everybody thinks that Black Americans are either Angela Davis or Stokely Carmichael, you know? I mean, so you get an instant pass, in other words. That actually changed dramatically with, I think, the Bush administration. When Black Americans and even Black women wound up with high-level positions in, say, the State Department, the White House, the Department of Defense, et cetera. So then people around the world started seeing Black American faces articulating imperialist notions and policies. And so that meant that in general, the trust quotient, you know, that you had to get over the threshold was higher in identifying yourself as separate from those views and those kinds of policies. Now, I think because of the Obama administration, because of whatever, you know, there are lots of Black Americans, Black American women circulating around the world in a lot of different capacities. And that does allow in the civil society space, at least, for, you know, you to be able to prove your own, you know, trustworthiness outside of presumptions, either presumptions to the left or presumptions to the right. Yeah, because it's not just, for me at least, it's not been just a question of how I am perceived by in international law and structured international law circles and settings. My sort of focus has always been the civil society, you know, oppressed communities context. So those are the issues that I've had to deal with as things changed also here in the US.
Thank you. Our time is running by, so I'm going to ask a separate question to each of the remaining three of you before we go to the questions that are in the chat that we have. So Professor George, what advice would you give to other Black women who want to get involved in international law?
Quite honestly, the first thing that came to my mind was, well, find some other Black women because you've been tremendous mentors to me. Dean Wing has been a constant fixture at ASIL, American Society of International Law, one of the first spaces that I saw and was welcoming. I could say the same for each of you, and Penny Andrews, who's not with us, or Bernadette Atahane. Find community within the international legal arena. Black women are a wonderful community, but they're certainly allies beyond us as well, because they will point you to opportunities. They will not diminish your dreams and will invite you to step forward. I mean, Tunde's story about being encouraged to apply for a special rapporteurship. So what I've found beyond the studying, the reading, getting out there, going to UN events, to human rights events. I literally cold called Human Rights Watch, and it sounds like for such a seller's offered to carry somebody's bags. So really just, I recommend, particularly if you are a Black woman, not to make assumptions about networks you may have or may not have. But if you do have the passion for this work, really putting yourself out there, asking others where opportunities are, sharing that information will serve you well, or that served me well personally. Frankly, I wouldn't be where I am without many of you being where you are and lifting me along. So.
Thank you. Professor Powell, what do you think the future holds for Black women in international law?
Well, let me use as a jumping off point that I recently went to the Afrofuturism room at the Met, Afrofuturism period room, right? So you walk through like the Roman Empire and the different period rooms, and you get to the Afrofuturism room, which was curated by the Oscar-winning, design producer for Black Panther,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it basically she's curated just different pieces that she was able to excavate from this community of Black folks who, 100 years ago lived basically where Central Park is now, right? So very valuable property, having just moved, back into Manhattan a couple a few months ago. And, but basically this Black community was relocated, right? To make way for urban renewal, eventually Central Park. The important point about Afrofuturism is that it both helps us think about the future by relating our current moment to where we came from. In the same way that Derek Bell talked about, space traders from the future who want to make a deal with Earthlings to sort of trade Black folks for saving the planet, and that sort of deal with the devil, like what would be chosen, right? Use futurism, in other words, to help us think about how after Plessy, to get from Plessy to Brown, people had to think about the future, to work hard so that we could be where we are today, right? So we could be around this Zoom table. And so I think in many ways, it's inspiring to think about Afrofuturism as a way of reflecting back on how people in the past got us to where we are today, and how we need to use this moment to help our children and our children's children get to a very different point, whether that's climate change, whether that's structural inequality, the whole array of issues. So when I think about what the future holds, I think about bringing together the past, the present, and the future using critical lenses like Afrofuturism as a way to inspire leaning in and being very transformative in this moment as we move forward.
Wonderful. Professor Achiume, what is the #1 way Black women in international law can make a difference?
Surprisingly enough, I actually have an answer that I think is the right one for myself, and I have it immediately. I mean, it's a really difficult question, but I really think that, and this is not only true for Black women in international law, I think this is true for Indigenous women in international law, for Latinx women in international law. I think it's to do the work on our own terms. And I was thinking about this in relation to your other question about the experience of being a Black woman in international law, what is it like in different parts of the world? And I think that the power of the contributions that we make are, of course, a product of all the talents, experiences, the things that people who are doing. But I think that there is something really powerful, whether it's from the perspective of kind of knowledge production, whether it's about advocacy, whether it's about litigation, that comes from doing the work on our own terms. And what I mean by that is doing the work in ways that resonate with our lived experiences and with our identities, as opposed to thinking that coming into international law means becoming an international lawyer. Because when I think about what becoming an international lawyer is, an international lawyer in the traditional sense of the word is a raced and gendered individual, as Professor McDougall was saying. And it's a kind of identity that has excluded the ways of being in this world that are the ones that make sense for those who are excluded, including Black women. And I think there's big ways and small ways in which doing international law can begin to ask you as a Black woman to fit into the mold of what an international lawyer is.
Right.
And in some ways you may think this is not a big deal. What does your hair look like? How do you speak? How do you dress? What sorts of issues are relevant to put on the table? How can you, and now I'm moving forward to how do you reimagine racial justice? All of these things, all of these decisions, all of these kind of moments, I think, are moments where we can do the work on our own terms, or we can, allow the systems that we are part of to dictate kind of our starting point in the work. And I think part of what's been phenomenal about the racial justice uprisings that we saw in 2020, which really were insisting on an account of racial justice that named kind of systemic racism, named historical legacies of kind of colonialism and slavery, is that you see that mobilization, which to my mind was one that was embarked upon with groups who were saying we're going to do this on our own terms and articulate our demands on our own terms. The result, to my mind, is actually a shift even in the global system in how issues to do with racial justice are being articulated. And so I guess my advice, the number one contribution that Black women can make to international law is to do the work on their own terms and to not feel like the system has to transform them into something different before they can be legible. And it's not easy work. It might mean toiling in obscurity at times, but to my mind, it's a non-negotiable.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the chat now. And what I'm thinking, there's several questions in the chat. And what I'm thinking is I'm going to ask them of several people, and this might be your last time speaking, okay? But still keep it succinct, all right? So the first question I'm going to ask is one to Ms. Sellers and Professor McDougall. And it is one where it says, to what extent do you feel you have achieved what you had hoped to achieve in your careers in international law? What would you like your legacy to be in the fields of international law? And I'm asking this to the two most senior members of this panel. So, but succinct as well in your answer. So first, Ms. Sellers.
Okay, I think once someone came up to Miles Davis and they didn't know him, so they kind of asked him at a cocktail party, well, what did you do? He said, well, I changed music 3 times. So I feel like I've achieved a lot. I've been remarkably rewarded in being able to see some of the changes of the way we look at genocide has been completely restructured now. The way we understand sexual violence as it relates to armed conflict becomes not only the acknowledged, but sometimes it's the leader of how we can understand where the perpetrator's mind is actually working. In terms of crimes against humanity, I would say the Rwanda Tribunal bringing forward the first conviction in modern history of rape as a crime against humanity. I achieved much more than I had the ability at a certain time period to imagine until I started doing like what Professor Powell said, this futurism thinking. But I'm still futurism thinking. I haven't finished achieving, okay? Before I kind of get out of here, we're going to make sure that the slave trade is recognized as international crime from historical perspective, but also actual perspective, and for it not to be confused with what is the white slave trade derivative of trafficking. They're 2 different jurisdictions, and that I want to make sure that we really understand in honor of our ancestors and our descendants, that those 2 crimes, slave trading and slavery, they have to take into account the historical basis. Just like no one would prosecute a genocide case without understanding the Holocaust, no one would look at what is enforced disappearance without understanding the Latin American experience. So not to whitewash, but remove the Blackness that paid for the blood for having the crime of enslavement and slave trading. That's what I'm working on now.
Thank you very much. And Professor McDougall?
Oh, what can I say after that? Well, I think I made an unparalleled contribution as an outsider to ending apartheid. That's what the South African government says when I got the award there, and did it on my own terms and in my own way. And that I have, been a beacon for, joining the issues of self-determination, decolonization, et cetera, on the international with the national. A founding member of Bringing Human Rights Home. Now sort of, I was one of the 3 people that actually created the George Floyd mechanism at the UN that is actually looking at excessive use of force by police and security officers around the world against people of African descent. And now trying to put shape and form and content into this platform on people of African descent, permanent forum on people of African descent. I've come a long way. When I first walked into the first time I walked into a human rights chamber at the UN as a member of a human rights body, this was 1995, must have been 800 people in the room. I was the only person of African descent from the diaspora in all of that. And so it's taken a long time to come around to all of you with me. And that is what I want my, please write it on my tombstone. There's some other things that could be said, but I have tried to lift as I climbed.
That's wonderful. I'll interject myself here since I'm 65. I think I'm with the more senior members of this group. I think I'm most proud of having helped the founding 4 mothers and 4 fathers of 3 constitutions. Like Gay, I was involved with the South African process, plus I advised on the Rwandan constitution post-genocide and also the Palestinian basic law. And those were profoundly moving things. And then I also think I'm most proud that I was able to do my career while managing 7 children, 2 of whom were my biological children, and 17 grandchildren. And all of them are pretty sane at the moment. And of course, that was very much dependent on many people helping me, including my partner, James. None of us know how long we have to live, whether it's tomorrow. I had 90 relatives affected by COVID, or whether, we'll be like President Mandela and live up until our 90s. But I feel it's the nature of the struggle that we're each engaged in. As Mandela said, the struggle is my life. And so no matter how much time we each have, and each of you in the audience, committing ourselves to the struggle for international justice is something that I've been very proud to do. And I know all of you are too. So we have about 10 minutes. And so for this 10 minutes, I want to raise a separate question with our remaining 3 speakers. And this is about mentorship. The question is, it seems like mentorships played a big role in each of your careers. Are there any recommendations you'd give to your younger self about developing meaningful mentoring relationships in international law? And actually, the 3 of you have been both mentors and mentored. So when you answer with only a few minutes each, can you comment from these 2 perspectives on this question? So first, Professor George.
Thank you very much. I have been mentored. I've been well mentored by you, by Penny Andrews, who's not on this call, and by so many more. And if I were giving advice to my younger self, it would simply be to keep in touch more, to really, I always follow what you're doing. I don't always let you know that I'm doing that, but really taking the time to show up for one another and to show your support for those who have mentored you. I really do think a lot about the people who've been my former professors, and I'll get in touch every once in a blue moon and I'll be like, where have you been? How have you been? And if I had it to do over, I would have been in more contact more often. I also benefit from peer mentoring. I think some of us are going through this all together. Many of us have never done this before. We're in positions that are trailblazing. So I used to have an email group of just my no committee or my yes committee, kind of women that I trust. And Catherine, you might have gotten emails like this from me. This is a situation, how do I navigate it? So being able to build authentic relationships takes time, invest the time in doing that. And then in mentoring others as they're coming along, no one should be interested in creating a mini me, right? So it's finding what that person is passionate about and being the supportive space for them to explore and to encourage them to be what you know they can be. I think many of us in this room, this is an online conversation I've been having. So Ketanji Brown Jackson, a graduate of Harvard Law School, there's a story circulating about how she was discouraged by her high school counselor from going to top universities. I was too. And years later, I met an older Black woman. We had the same counselor, and literally the verbatim advice to just don't bother, just don't try. Be the person that encourages someone to try and to see the possibility in others. That enough is alone usually something that enables the opening of a relationship that can be authentic. And one, to echo, they do this on your own terms. Be the person who invites somebody to be who they are and who they can be.
Thank you, Professor Powell.
Yeah, really just to reiterate what Erica just said, you know, and I want to give a shout out to Gabrielle Kirk McDonald, who's another not only founding mother of the Black tradition in international law, but also has been an important mentor, as have everyone in the Zoom room. You know, I went to law school, and not to date myself, but at a time where there were no Black women, you know, on the faculty at Yale Law School, and there were frankly very few women. I remember Ruth Wedgwood and Leah Brillmeyer were both on leave. They were like the two women on the faculty. I took a class with Catherine McKinnon only because she was visiting. But oftentimes I found, even when you don't have mentors, and I was very lucky to have, you know, white and Black male mentors in law school. But even when you don't have people in your immediate institution who can mentor you, to reach out, and just the importance of thinking about community beyond the walls of wherever, you know, whatever site location you're in. When Melissa Murray was a student at Yale, she invited me back because she created like a Black women's reading group, right? And so thinking of ways to bring people to you, even if they're not already there. The only other thing I would say is the importance of thinking outside the box. I mean, it is true that we have to be twice as good to be considered half as good, and that you have to, you know, work hard and jump through some of the hoops that, you know, may be required to get into whatever field, but to also think beyond the traditional, whether it's clerking in a federal court, thinking about the South African Constitutional Court or other courts in other countries, or international tribunals, doing a clerkship, right, for international tribunals. Those are opportunities I wish I had thought about as a law student that I didn't think about, that I think you can still get very, you know, this similar or as good training clerking for those kinds of institutions. So thinking outside the box, even while realizing you have to be twice as good as a Black woman to just, you know, be able to be at the table.
Professor Powell mentioned the Honorable Gabrielle Kirk McDonald, and she's actually put a question in the chat that we didn't get to. But for those of you who don't know, in the beginning of this session, Tina mentioned that there's the Cambridge book on Black women in international law from 2015. Well, that book was in honor of the Honorable Gabrielle Kirk McDonald, and she was the founding co-chair along with me of BASIL, and she's been a fabulous mentor to so many people. And so I'm glad that you're in this session and can spend this time with us. And so now the final say will on this question of mentoring will go to Professor Achimi.
Thanks. So just two things. I think one thing I would tell my younger self that it's something that I've come to realize is that you don't have to know your mentors, and you don't even have to speak to your mentors, all of them necessarily. Sometimes mentorship can be about learning more about, if you're a Black women who've done the sort of work that you're interested in doing, right? So Gay, I know you now and have come to you in the rapporteurship, and you've been there for me in really important ways. But even before I met you, I was reading your work, and your work was really powerful for me in a kind of mentoring role in terms of shaping what I thought was possible with my own career. So I think thinking about mentorship in those broad ways, thinking about how you can connect with people who inspire you, even if you don't ever meet them. And then I would echo something that I can't remember if it was Catherine or Eric, or maybe they both said it, which is just really having a diverse set of mentors, you know, and being able to distinguish among them who are the ones who you go to when you have new and kind of new ideas, precious ideas, things that feel fragile, that you're looking for people who can help you build them up, right? And knowing who they are and going to them first. Having mentors who actually are in opposition to the way that you see the world, so that when you now want to test out something that you feel more confident in, you can do it in a space of mentorship, but definitely of opposition, you know? So really thinking with that kind of strategic lens, you know, set of glasses on when you think about how you reach out to people for mentorship, understanding that different people can be really powerful and transformative for different purposes, and not all of your mentors should look like you. You want them to look very different from you in some cases, but also ensuring that they are those who are kind of the ones who you go to when you are most vulnerable and fragile, I think is also important.
Well, I'm glad that we can end on,
Adrian,
sorry. Did
can
you
I
want to-
just,
Yes.
yeah, I just have to put one word in here,
Sure.
because there are mentors that are no longer here. And one of my chief mentors was Gola Butcher.
Mm.
You know, few of you know her now because she died too early, but she was a wonderful mentor. And she was one of the leading figures in ASIL as a Black woman before there was Basil or anybody else.
Mhm.
You know, we worked after her death to establish a medal, American International Law Journal medal, the Gola Butcher Medal, which is given out periodically to people who do groundbreaking new kind of work
Mhm.
in international law. And I just think we can't close this session without mentioning her name as well. So
Thank you so much. That is a wonderful way to end this session. Generally, the question on mentorship and ending in the memory of our shero, Gola Teal Butcher. I'd like to thank my fellow panelists, my sisters in international law, for their participation, and also, of course, thank the organizers of the panel, Tina and Hiba, and the Journal for sponsoring us. And we hope that everyone will enjoy the rest of the symposium and have a very good weekend. So thank you all for coming, and please feel free to get in touch with any of us to follow up on any of the issues, questions, or other issues that you may have. So thank you all very, very much.
And I just
Thank
want to
you.
say from behalf of the Journal, thank you so much. This was a fantastic, amazing panel. And I don't think I just speak for myself when I say that it was very, very inspiring too. So thank you, and a special thanks to Dean Wing. And I hope we will see you all as audiences too in the symposium, and we keep to stay in touch. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.